So it is, or by the time this video premieres, at least, it will be July 4th, Independence Day here in the good old US of A. But not just any Independence Day. No, July 4th of this year, 2026, marks the 250th anniversary of the official founding of the United States of America. Something makes me question whether we'll make it another 250 years, but that's another matter, I suppose. We have made it 250 years, which is pretty good for a republic, I would say. And that's something probably to be proud of. So I knew I was going to have to do some reading befitting the occasion. And what I ultimately selected to read for Independence Day 2026 was the monumental History of the United States of America, Conceived in Liberty by the economist and political philosopher and historian Murray Rothbard. So this is a 5-volume work, which was actually for the longest time only a 4-volume work. Rothbard wrote this back in, I think, the 1970s with an endowment fund, which he had been extended to write a history of the United States. But due to circumstances, only the first 4 volumes ended up being published at that time. The 5th volume was only recently published a few years ago, I think. It was like written in longhand, like it was complete, but it wasn't like typed and it wasn't really like edited. But it was finished up and finally published, which at last completed the series. Now, the first 4 installments of Conceived in Liberty are collected in this edition into a single volume, and it is, I do believe, the longest single book that I own. It is over 1,500 pages long. The entire thing is in the neighborhood of like 18 to 1,900 pages in length. Y'all just go ahead and hit that like button down there just for the sheer dedication that it took to read this behemoth of a work. It took me about half a year, I think, to read this, but I have to say it was a fascinating look at the founding of the United States of America, and one which is written from an interesting perspective. Rothbard approaches this subject. He looks at this subject through the lens of liberty versus power, and by power meaning state power. And if you are at all familiar with Murray Rothbard, that will make perfect sense. But this is kind of in distinction from certain other historians, because some historians of the United States have kind of asserted that, like, the American Revolution was ultimately like a kind of conservative event, whereas other historians have posited contrarily that the American Revolution constitutes some sort of like proto-socialist uprising. And Rothbard rejects both of those positions in his history of the United States and says that the fundamental struggle of the American Revolution and the founding of the United States of America was the struggle between liberty and power. And once again, by power meaning state power. Now, I can't summarize everything that's in this work because it is many pages in length, and it covers a lot of time. It starts with like the original, like very first, you know, colonizing. It starts basically in like pre-colonial times with the very first colonies established in America. And then it ultimately works its way up to the Revolutionary War. And that's kind of how volume 4 ends, pretty much, is with the victory of the colonists in the Revolutionary War. But then volume 5 is about the drafting and ratification of the United States Constitution. And I want to talk specifically about this one by itself for a little bit, because that's the one where he gets very revisionist and really kind of goes against the grain, but it is very interesting because of it. Now, so to kind of summarize volumes 1 through 4, like I say, it starts out with the original, like the founding of the original settlements in the United States by Great Britain. It works its way through their kind of the formulation of a different like outlook, a different perspective from the mother country, the kind of gradual separation in spirit. It covers the philosophical development of the colonists under the like using the work of Locke and Montesquieu, right? It eventually works its way up to like the breaking point where with like the rebellion against the Stamp Act and the Boston Tea Party and such like that. Then we go into the Revolutionary War and we get an extended play-by-play of that conflict and the ultimate victory of the colonists against Great Britain, which was the largest empire on the planet at the time. No small feat, I'll say. But I'm not, like I say, I'm not going to like summarize all of this blow by blow because this thing is so long that I'm honestly kind of fuzzy, perhaps, regarding certain of the earlier, events and happenings. It's by the time you get to the end of this whole thing, it's so long that you kind of start to forget, what happened at the beginning. But I will say this: it illustrates, first and foremost, it is a perfect illustration of that line from the book of Ecclesiastes, which says, "There is nothing new under the sun." One thing that really struck me about reading Conceived in Liberty is that a lot of the things, if not all of the things that we deal with today in terms of, politics and economics and stuff like that, have probably been tried in the past in one form or fashion. And like I say, Conceived in Liberty really kind of demonstrates that quite well. As an example, America actually had flirted with, or the colonists, I should say, actually had flirted with like socialism in the past. I mean, like genuine socialism, where some of the early colonists, some of the early settlers in America actually operated under a system of collectivized property, which almost did them in until they privatized. But beyond that, we also see that America has a history of theocracy as well, like with the Puritans, right? As well as like the Anglican Church, trying to establish religion with the power of the state, and how that leads to various frictions and injustices as well. We see that a lot of the things that still, are in the conversation today, they've been tried in the past. And it really, Conceived in Liberty really does show that there really is nothing new under the sun. But also, it shows how royally screwed the Native Americans were. I mean, we all knew that. I knew that. But, like, you might not be aware of just, like, the depth to which they were screwed and how the level of injustice which was done them, how they got stabbed in the back, kind of double-crossed in some instances, and just treated far worse than they deserved, really. And like this book really does ram home just how screwed the Indians were by the colonists. But beyond that, it does also demonstrate how based and awesome the Quakers were. If there is any one group out of colonial America that can be pointed to as actually like representing, kind of a moral high ground, I think it could probably be the Quakers. The Quakers really were based. They were very principled for the longest until eventually they kind of sold out. But for the longest time, the Quakers really were really like based and awesome. They stood against injustices against the Native Americans in large part, and against Africans as well, because we can never forget how screwed the Africans were, shipped in for slave labor and worked like cattle, right? But the Quakers like really were, they were really cool, honestly. I really have to say I have a great appreciation for the Society of Friends for the Quakers after reading this book, because they really did take a stand in a lot of cases, and I really respect that. But another thing that this book demonstrates is that a lot of the figures which we have been taught to revere are really not worthy of reverence, really. That's the thing, is that Rothbard's perspective, he is really not pulling any punches. He is looking at things through his lens, and if it doesn't measure up, then he calls it out. And by that I mean, like, Benjamin Franklin is pretty much called out as a conniving, unscrupulous, opportunistic piece of shit. George Washington was also pretty much a tool, and also a horrible general as well. Like, the notion that a lot of people may have of Washington is like this strategic mastermind, this master strategist, this military genius, it is an absolute joke. Washington was a military imbecile who has very little to show in terms of success in his military campaigns of his own. Washington was a pretty horrible general whose military and political career was largely advanced due to his political views and affiliations, more so than any actual skill. And also, Alexander Hamilton, well, I knew this already, but Alexander Hamilton was an absolute fiend who essentially wanted to undo what the revolution had accomplished and just reinstitute a type of monarchy or aristocracy on the English model. Yeah, Alexander Hamilton was a real piece of shit. Aaron Burr did us all a favor, y'all. Like, justice for Aaron Burr, capped that fool like a G and did the world a favor, right? Or, if you ask me anyway. But a lot of these figures that we revere, like these founding fathers, they're really not worthy of reverence. Rothbard's really kind of knocks these sacred cows. He tips these sacred cows in this work and shows that it's not nearly as glamorous as the official textbooks would make out. These people were human, grievously so, and they look very small and petty a lot of the time. But beyond all that, what Conceived in Liberty really demonstrates is, more than anything else, I think, is that it is a ringing endorsement it is a vindication of Lord Acton's classic dictum that power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Because we see through this history these various figures who are fighting for a reasonably just cause. This is not just like the actual Revolutionary War. No, there were lots of uprisings and rebellions prior to that in American history. And we see these people fighting against perceived injustices, fighting for a better world, trying to do right by their own lights, right? But then we see, once they gain power, they're fighting for liberty, but once they gain power, their ideals fall by the wayside and their principles are largely abandoned. And this is kind of the crux of the book. This is the heart of what Rothbard set out to kind of explicate, is that there is an eternal conflict between liberty and power. That power, specifically by that I mean state power, is always inimical to liberty, and these things they're constantly at war. And the good guys turn into the bad guys if given long enough and if given enough power. That's kind of the main takeaway, I think, from Conceived in Liberty, is that power truly does corrupt. And if you don't think it does, then read the book and see for yourself. But that's kind of the overview of volumes 1 through 4. Now I want to talk specifically about volume 5, because this is truly the most radical one. It is truly the most revisionist one, and the one where Rothbard really goes the hardest against the grain. And that is because he very, very incisively critiques the drafting and ratification of the United States Constitution, which, again, in mainstream history textbooks, we were taught that was like that's like the pinnacle of the American experience, right? That was truly like the best thing that these people ever did, was draft and ratify this Constitution. No, not according to Rothbard. According to Rothbard, the United States Constitution is nothing less than a betrayal of what the Revolutionary War was fought for. Echoing Albert J. Nock, Rothbard asserts, again, hard against the grain, that the Articles of Confederation were actually superior to the United States Constitution. At least, that is, if your criteria for good is that government has sufficient restraint. Because again, the heart of conceived in liberty is that there is always a conflict between liberty and power, that power will eventually attack and erode liberty. And so if our criteria for what constitutes good government is that government is sufficiently restrained and restricted, then the Articles of Confederation were definitely superior to the United States Constitution, because the Constitution, through some clever wording, essentially was able to extend to the government a blank check with which it could and has, since its ratification, used to ever expand and increase its power. Now, it should also be noted that the drafting and ratification of the Constitution was accomplished with great fraud, chicanery, and duplicity. Again, that's a lot of that's left out of the official history textbooks that we get in school. And also, Rothbard shows that certain of these figures, these the people behind the Constitution, were very avid proponents of public education, because they intended to use public education to mold a certain type of individual to be the perfect citizen, which of course only goes to show that public education has always been primarily about indoctrination and, again, molding a certain type of person, not about, blessing us all with the gifts of knowledge and learning. It's primarily about molding people to fit a certain end. But the drafting of the Constitution and its ratification was, again, accomplished with a great deal of lies, fraud, chicanery, and duplicity, including malapportionment of delegates and control and manipulation of the press and mail as well. These people cheated to get this Constitution done. And, I think the noblest figure of the anti-federalists, like those people, like those who fought the Constitution and fought for a Bill of Rights to be inserted in that Constitution, which is the only thing that makes that Constitution even remotely noble, is that Bill of Rights, specifically the Second Amendment. But the noblest figure out of all of those people, I think, was Patrick Henry, because he was like one of the only ones who never sold out. And once more, the main takeaway from Conceived in Liberty, as far as I'm concerned anyway, is that principles fall by the wayside as these conflicts go on. People are often tempted to, try to ally themselves with whatever is expedient, even at the cost of their one-time morals, their one-time ideals. And so many of these anti-federalists, which again were the people who opposed the Constitution rightly, I would say, Rothbard would say, and I would now say, sold out in the end and caved and ratified, even if they were openly betraying their constituency who elected them to not ratify the Constitution. A lot of them just like flat out went against what their constituency wanted. But Patrick Henry never did. Patrick Henry really, he held out to the last. He fought the good fight, and he never gave up. And that's why he's probably the best figure, the best character that you will encounter in these works, this one long extended work. Patrick Henry really did fight the good fight, and he fought it to the end. And I say salute to Patrick Henry. But again, the Anti-Federalists were responsible for the insertion of the Bill of Rights, which once more is the only thing about the Constitution that is actually, that makes that document truly like noble, because the Federalists did not want any kind of Bill of Rights. They wanted no prohibitions on state power. They wanted truly carte blanche to do whatever was deemed necessary or expedient for the government to do. And if the Anti-Federalists can be said to have triumphed in anything, it would be the fact that they did get that Bill of Rights in there. And I want to emphasize, like, I want to greatly and like passionately emphasize that the most important amendment in that Bill of Rights, the most important entry in that Bill of Rights, is the Second Amendment, that the right to keep and bear arms which shall not be infringed, but of course has been greatly infringed, as Rothbard points out in this book, because like if you read the wording, it explicitly says shall not be infringed. Like that right was never supposed to be transgressed. But of course, the states have individually done that to a great degree. States like California and New Jersey have made the acquisition of firearms in many instances very difficult to get and to legally use. And of course, if you do use them even legally, you're liable to be burned by their legal systems. But again, we see that even with these amendments, they don't really mean anything. Even with these Bill of Rights, they don't really mean anything, because the government will just expand its power with its cleverly worded clauses in here, such ends as the common welfare and whatnot, the common good. Its power has, I mean, ever since the ratification of this document, its power has expanded. And nowadays, the burning irony of it all is that nowadays the citizens of the United States are taxed at levels that the government of Great Britain in the late 1700s could never have even dreamed of, that could never have even imagined. And another thing that Rothbard points out about the drafters of the Constitution, the people behind the Constitution, like Alexander Hamilton most notably, they wanted this Constitution because they wanted an empire. That's the thing. Had we stuck with the Articles of Confederation, we would have had a very loose affiliation of largely autonomous states that could have made their own rules, and that the citizens thereof could have supported or not supported by, as they say, voting with their feet. Things could have been tried, and greater liberty could have been preserved by not having a strongly centralized government. But the people behind the Constitution wanted this Constitution because they wanted their empire. They wanted to be like Great Britain and rule large swaths of the earth. And we have the American empire now. We have the American empire. It is falling apart. It costs, the costs to maintain this empire are exorbitant, more than can probably be maintained for too terribly much longer. The United States has existed in a near constant state of war since its inception, or at least since the Civil War anyway. There has been some kind of conflict always going on. Nothing has changed in that regard now either. These people wanted this Constitution because they wanted to strengthen the government, because they wanted to strengthen like America's standing on the global stage. They wanted that empire, and they got that empire, and now it's killing itself, because the costs of empire eventually become greater than that empire can maintain, I would say. And Rothbard just lays all that bare. He really does. He lays all that bare in this, that the ideals for which the American Revolution were fought were ultimately noble, but they were very quickly abandoned and trampled upon by the very people who fought for them initially in order to get their Leviathan. That's what they wanted. That's what they got. And all the nobility, all the noble things and values which they fought for and which are worth fighting for were abandoned, dropped by the wayside as time went on. And so now we have the lumbering Leviathan, which taxes us at rates that Great Britain could never have dreamed of, and does things with those taxes which are criminal to the nth degree. It's perhaps I'm getting off on a tangent, I suppose, but I found Conceived in Liberty to be a roundly fantastic history of the United States because it tells this story from a perspective which is not normally told and which is damn sure not told in the like official textbooks that school children are given in American public schools, because again, public education is primarily a tool for control rather than enlightenment. But this book really lays bare some little known and often uncomfortable truths of the American founding, and I think it is an immensely valuable work. It is written from a very clear perspective, and it never deviates. It's largely it does not pull its punches at all. Rothbard, he's looking at things through this lens of liberty versus power, and he does not shy away from the rather unfortunate failings of these various people who started out noble but were ultimately corrupted by the end. And once more, I thoroughly enjoyed this work. It is very thorough in its own right. It is very revealing. There's a lot of stuff in here that I think a lot of people would not be familiar with. And once more, it doesn't pull any punches. It's revisionist in a sense, but it justifies itself. I think it really does, and I really liked it. So I don't rate non-fictional works typically, but I do think Conceived in Liberty is a remarkable work and a remarkably valuable work as well. It is a great counterpoint to a lot of other histories of America that may be floating around out there. And if you are interested in the history of the United States from its earliest settling to the drafting and ratification of the Constitution, you really may just owe it to yourself to read this because it has a lot to offer. It really does. And I got a lot out of it myself. I know that. So, Conceived in Liberty by Murray Rothbard. Have you read Conceived in Liberty? If you have, let me know down in the comments what you thought about it, whether you have agreed or disagreed with anything I've said about it here today. And once again, if you haven't read Conceived in Liberty, give a thought to doing so. It is massive. Again, it's in the neighborhood of like 1900 odd pages long. But it has a lot to offer. It really does. It is very illuminating, very revealing, and not always pleasantly so. But it has a narrative and it tells it quite well, I think. And I think that anyone out there again who is interested in the history of the United States of America would probably do well to read it. And happy birthday to the United States of America for whatever that's worth. Happy Independence Day, y'all. And until next time, peace.